Welcome to Sundays with Jane Eyre. This is episode 15, Presentiments are Strange Things. We're covering volume 2, chapter 6, or chapter 21 of Charlotte Bronte's Jane Eyre. I am Edward G. Pettit of the Rosenbach in Philadelphia, and joining me today as co-hosts are Dr. Lauren Nixon, sorry, a little thing in my throat there, and Mary Going. Welcome back, you two.
It's
Hi,
great as always to be back. Yeah,
just
happy
seeing
New Year's,
you
everyone.
causes a hitch in my breath, right? So it's like, you're back. Thank you for coming back. How were your holidays and New Year's? You got through them? Over?
I think we both ended up having holidays that weren't quite what we had hoped for or thought would happen. So I mean, Lauren, you definitely had the worst of it.
Yeah, I went to the hospital.
Oh no.
So it turns out I have no blood. So yeah, turns out I was severely anemic.
No,
and had to be taken into
And you just discussed
very gothic of me.
Wow, yeah.
Yeah.
Well, don't get consumption. So,
Yeah, it was, I feel like it was a very fitting, if I was going to have an illness, having extremely low hemoglobin was probably the one, that or consumption, like it had to be one of the two. So yeah, the Christmas break didn't quite go as I had intended because fortunately they let me out of hospital on Christmas Eve so I could go home. But I did spend most of the Christmas break either sat down or lying down. The hospital were not happy about me walking places. I was like, I'm fine. I'm just gonna like walk to the toilet, and they were like, sit back down. Down. Like you could go at any point. And I was like, oh, okay. But I've had some iron infusions and they've done all sorts of tests on me, and I'm significantly better now. So I'm glad to be here because I've been going a little bit stir crazy.
All righty. Well, and it'll be a great year for you. You will recover and adapt, and it will be wonderful.
Yes, that's my hope.
All righty. I just finished watching I'm just getting started there, everybody. I just finished watching the Moby Dick marathon reading from New Bedford. They did it online this year. I don't know if you guys have ever been to or done a Moby Dick marathon. We've actually done 2 at the Rosenbach. We've hosted. So I've actually organized them, but I've also been to a couple others too. And it was a lot. I got to read this year, and it was all video. It was all online, so I could participate. I wasn't going to New Bedford, Massachusetts right now, the second week of January. And I got to read chapter 108, Ahab and the Carpenter, and it was very cool. Do a little video of it and send it to them, and they put them all together, and it was such a good thing. And everybody just look up the New Bedford Moby Dick marathon reading. It's on YouTube. They did the whole 25 or so hours of readings are on there, and some of them are really, really good this year. It was a nice reading. So I'm a little bit sad because when I didn't stay up all night to watch it, but it's still the end of Moby Dick is not a happy ending book. So I was very invested this morning, and then boy, all right, it's not going to be a Moby Dick year, that's for sure.
Yeah, I've never done a Moby Dick marathon. I used to do them when I was part of the Jane Austen Festival, because we had like a spate of years where it was anniversary years. So like 2011, 2012, 2014. So we would do over the course of the festival, we'd do the novel that was having its bicentenary, it would have been. So I did Emma, and I think I did Mansfield Park, and I think I did Pride and Prejudice.
Were they marathon? Were they all in one shot, like start and end, or were there breaks? We used
to do like breaks because we obviously had events in the evening, so it would be like there would be like a block. We used to do it in the library, so you could come and sit and listen, and then also like everyone just browsing in the library could listen into it, so that was really nice as well. I miss that kind of thing. They're always fun, aren't they?
They're fun. We thought about doing one we were thinking we're going to do another marathon reading and for the Rosenbach, and Pride and Prejudice was on the table as a, maybe this would be a good one, but it's probably going to be a different one. But I'm still working out details, so can't talk about it yet. All righty. Well, all you erudite Bronte stores and airheads, thank you guys for coming today. And if you're new to the show, just a note on our format, if you're watching live on Zoom, the chat is for you to talk to each other. And if you have a question or a comment for the three of us, put it in the Q&A so we see it. It's a little too hard to completely follow the chat all the time. And if you're streaming, if you're watching live on YouTube where we are streaming, I encourage you to like and subscribe. Like the show and subscribe to the Rosenbach channel and leave a comment. Liking, subscribing, and comments, even on the past episodes, help us gain greater visibility and grow our audience. Before we start today, I wanted to get your take on Rochester as the old fortune teller, which just happened in, for our last week's show. We did the 2 chapters, Rochester as pretending he's the old woman, and then Mason, being attacked, and Jane having to help. But one of the things that really strikes me at the end of that exchange with Rochester and Jane is how unangry Jane is that he has done this to her, that he has pretended he was this old woman fortune teller to really get her to, open up and tell him some things in secret that he wants to know. He wants to know about her attachment to him. That's what he's driving at. And I wanted to get your impression of that very famous scene, because I love hearing when you guys talk about things, and I hate when you miss important scenes. And I'm like, oh, I want to talk to Mary and Lauren about this. So.
Well, I always think it's a really interesting kind of flip of quite a classic scene from like a sentimental novel. Famously, Samuel Richardson's Pamela, Mr. B disguises himself as an old woman who works for him to physically get into bed with Pamela, and tries to use that as a way to get close to her. And it's kind of implied he's going to use it to sexually assault her, but Pamela faints, which we've talked about this before. It's a classic trope. Even the most terrible of rakes won't sexually assault a woman when she's fainted. There's this like protection to fainting, and of course he has to be redeemable at the end of the novel. So he dresses up and he pretends to be this old woman, and tries to trick Pamela. And you see this happen a couple of times. There's a couple of novels where people escape dressed as women, and they use it to get into a female space and things like that. So it's very classic, more sentimental novel than Gothic novel trope, but definitely does become part of the Gothic novel. But it's usually always used to violate a female space. And it is an interesting kind of take on it, because we, the reader, know that Rochester probably isn't the type of person, we're fairly certain this is not the type of man to take advantage of a woman in his household, because she, he would have done it by now. Jane is actually quite vulnerable. If this was a novel in the 1750s, we'd be reading it thinking, oh my God, this guy is gonna, he's gonna try and attack her, because that's what happens when characters like Pamela are left alone in the household of a young man rather than a matriarch. So him kind of doing this.
One of the things we talked about last week is how he wants her to choose him. That's what he wants. Exactly. Now he's going to also create the scenario where what is he going to do but choose him. But he wants that.
And he's kind of playing with that idea of like, he is an anti-hero, but he's not dastard, like he's not a terrible person. His redemption isn't about, I used to be a drinker and a cavorter and maybe even a rapist or a criminal. His is more of a, I'm a curmudgeon, and obviously there is a crime he has committed, but it has a complexity to it. So the way that we approach this scene is kind of ridiculous, and because he's taking on the visage of a fortune teller, is Jane someone who's going to believe a fortune teller anyway? They already have a very liminality, real liminality to them. Is she roamer? Is she traveler? Is she false? Is she true? She already exists in this weird space. That it's not like, oh, she's the housekeeper. So it's I think it's a really interesting scene that is very keenly calling back to certain things. Like, most readers would be familiar with this, the male lead disguises himself as an old woman trope, but there's something different to it here, where Jane has more power in the situation perhaps than she would in a different situation. She's not going to let a fortune teller woman touch her physically. There's still this kind of distance in this space, that I think is another one of these examples that we have throughout this novel of Bronte using a trope that is kind of conservative and adding a layer to it that is, kind of revolutionary. And right back at the beginning when we said it's not really revolutionary, but is pulling back on that romanticism, is pulling back on that Gothic ridiculousness and camp and play, and still kind of respecting Jane's boundaries while pushing them in a way that we don't often see male leads do. Mm-hmm. He disrespects her in ways that we would expect male leads to respect her, but then respects her in some of the ways that other male leads that are really frustrating don't. He doesn't encroach on her in the same way. Mm-hmm. So that's kind of, that's my take on it when you think about it as a trope in the broader narrative of the novel.
Mary?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, all I would add is just to emphasize that it really shows Rochester's kind of performance and play. And I guess as well, what this does is it eventually reveals Mr. Rochester here are some of my secrets and no one else knows them. No one else knows that he was playing the gypsy woman. And at the same time, if you think back, like, no one else knows that. So Jane knows that she helped him and saved him from the fire. And it's just another way where she thinks she's in his confidence. But as the last part of the chapter reveals, he still has lots of secrets. And it's this whole idea of, hidden identities and what's real and what's formed. And I think even though we might think they're coming to know each other, there's still a lot that they don't know. So I think it's really interesting in that. That idea of play and how well you can really know someone.
And he's doing nothing but playing roles. I mean, he's doing the whole playing the role, with Blanche and everyone else being there. And so this is, it really fits in with him. Lauren, it's mentioned, you mentioned Pamela again, too, Samuel Richardson's Pamela. And we mentioned it last week. And the more I read this and where this keeps coming up, I almost kind of, it's like Charlotte Bronte's rewriting of Pamela. It's almost like, like Frankenstein is, Mary Shelley rewriting Paradise Lost, or, it's such, I hadn't realized it was such a seminal text to this book, but the more we keep mentioning it, the more I think that, do we know? I mean, she's mentioned in here, but I wonder if Bronte ever wrote about, in letters at least, Richardson.
I don't know if she ever references Richardson directly. We know that Richardson was definitely on their reading list.
Yeah.
I think particularly when you read Anne Bronte, you see Richardson really clearly.
Yeah.
When you think about the Tenants, so the Tenant of Wildfell Hall, for those of you who aren't familiar with it, is probably Anne's most famous novel, and that is a novel about what happens after the heroine marries the so-called reformed rake, and he reverts back to his ways, and she is absolutely ruined because she doesn't have family anymore, and it's it's not dissimilar to something like the Scarlet Letter. Like, it's very interested in the idea of sin and shame and status and what happens, when a woman is in that situation. And things like Oscar Wilde's Woman of No Importance are almost a reimagining of a text like Tenant of Wildfell Hall.
Mm-hmm.
But Agnes Grey also does a very similar thing. You have a young woman who is in a situation, she's educated, but she's not noble, so to speak. She must make a living, and the living that she must make is in the houses of these patriarchs.
Yeah.
And I think it's really interesting when we think about how much Jane Eyre is a novel that constantly gets reimagined. And I think, to me, this is, I've kind of been saying this the whole way through, but there's a lot of reworking of Gothic tropes in this. And I think the reason that Jane Eyre lends itself so fantastically to things like Wide Sargasso Sea, to things like Rebecca, is because, and even things like, you know, Gaslight and films like that, I think are very heavily inspired by these kinds of situations where you are a woman on your own. And this chapter really, to me, highlights that she's on her own, because she has to tell Rochester, no, I do have family, but they don't give a crap about me. I think because she's already reworking, that's why we get so many reworkings of this text, in the same way that with Frankenstein, you know, it's so adaptable because it's already adapting things itself, and it gives life to that ability. But I think with Pamela, you know, we talked about this right at the beginning, didn't we, about the fact that Bronte is relatively conservative in a lot of ways, not necessarily ways that we would consider to be conservative today, but she was, you know, from a somewhat conservative family. But even things like Pamela, you know, Jane and Pamela aren't that different. They are the same root idea, a young woman who is poor but intelligent and good-hearted, and, you know, but instead of being outstandingly beautiful so that everyone falls in love with her instantly, she's plain. And you know, instead of having parents but they've fallen from, you know, wealth, she's got no parents. And, you know, it blends all of these Gothic tropes in, and it's almost like a Pamela for the 19th century, without all of the things that make Pamela problematic for a woman who is, you know, in that kind of like feminist phase. But yeah, I just, Fielding, I hate Pamela, as we've said before, but, you know,
Fielding took care of all the satire of Pamela already, like long ago.
And don't forget Hayward
with his, you know, Shamala and Joseph Andrews.
Exactly.
But I am surprised that, you know, that Richardson is still having this reach, you know, 100 years after Pamela is written. He's still influencing novels. But I think this is where it ends. Isn't it? Like, I don't think Richardson reaches into the rest of the 19th century. And
and I think that's partially because of schools. Richardson's on the required reading list. You gave your daughters excerpts from Richardson, and I think because we're hitting a point of governesses and schooling rather than you're being educated by your mother, maybe a tutor if you're really rich, Richardson starts to go by the wayside, because they don't need him anymore. Like, they don't need that type of didacticism. They need more practical texts, because they're actually, you know, having formal schooling. Thank God.
Kristen asks if Pamela was considered more of a moral cautionary tale, or was it more sensational? I think it's a bit didactic. Of both myself. I mean, it's definitely the moral cautionary tale, but Richardson knows that he's titillating his readers, even though he's never going to admit it.
No, and, you know, he kind of goes back on himself with Clarissa, because in that the rake is irredeemable. But, like, he writes a book at a time where all of these young men are doing what?
And we got a first we had a first glitch from you.
Families.
Say that sentence again. We got a first glitch from
you. I was saying, you know, we have a reformed rake in Pamela. So very much like what you see from, if you want to know what the rake is, it's what we find out John Reed's been doing in this chapter, you know, cavorting, getting into trouble, ending up in jail, absolutely ruining his household. So all of these young women, these middle-class young women, were expected to marry these rakes. And Richardson publishes a book about a reformed rake at a time when this is happening. So there is this kind of like, oh, well, yeah, you should do this. And then, you know, obviously he gets taken the mickey out of. But yeah, there is an element of sensationalism to it, but it is also intended to be not so much a cautionary tale, because Pamela wins in the end, but you know, she doesn't go astray. But it is supposed to follow in her footsteps, learn from Pamela's good deeds.
That's as you mentioned the rake too, and with John Eyre, and that's the position that that Charlotte Bronte gives that figure in this novel is just this. She shows him as a child, and then you hear of him, but she doesn't want to put him in front of the novel. The better character for her and is Rochester, who isn't an actual rake. So
yeah, it's very much a kind of like, we're not even going to give the rake the time of day in this text, because there is a bit of a sympathy for the devil aspect with a lot of rake characters. They tend to be more fun. So, you know, even in the ones where, I mean, it even happened with Clarissa, everyone was like,
I know, you
know, he writes this 1,000-page novel being like, this man is the worst man in the world, and people were like, ooh,
and then
exciting.
Yeah. And then the BBC adaptation with Sean Bean playing him.
They put Sean Bean.
Yeah, I mean, Sharpie plays, and I'm like, how can I not be attracted to Lovelace? So yeah,
they didn't learn their lesson, because the radio drama was Richard Armitage.
There you go.
So of course you're gonna fall for that voice. I mean, I know it has to be believable, but really, come on, don't put Sean Bean as your villain. I don't want to
go any further than the Richardson Road, but it never ceases to amaze me. Now that I'm doing what it was amazing me. I'm sorry, is reading that Jane Eyre now, and how kind of important that text seemed to be for Charlotte Bronte and formulating the ideas of putting this book together. So. The end of the last chapter, the Rochester again almost opens up to her in the garden after they send Mason off, and sure enough, you know, then he pulls back right away and then starts joking about Blanche again, and that's where we ended. So now we're on volume 2, chapter 6. Right? Yeah, chapter 6. And we're chapter 21 if you're reading a novel with continuous chapters, everyone. And the chapter starts with this Mary, why don't you read the opening paragraph of this, which is so important, I think, in this book.
Yeah, of course.
And then we're really gonna like go in and like close read this opening paragraph. At least that's what I want to do.
Oh, me too, and I'm sure Lauren as well.
Good.
Presentiments are strange things, and so are signs, and the three combined make one mystery to which humanity has not yet found the key. I never laughed at presentiments in my life, because I have had strange ones of my own. Sympathies, I believe, exist. For instance, between far distant, long absent, wholly estranged relatives, asserting notwithstanding unity of the source to which each traces his origin, whose workings baffle mortal comprehension. And signs, for aught we know, may be but the sympathies of nature with man.
Righty.
It's such a great opening. Because it kind of looks backwards and it looks forwards at the same time. The whole idea of presentiments meaning essentially like feelings, intuitions of possibly of impending doom, things that are going to be bad, sympathies and signs as well, the idea that we can read things in things that are happening, but also, as we'll get to the next few paragraphs, in dreams, and also sympathies with people, and connections that you can make that perhaps pass beyond nearness, which looks forward to, no spoilers, but stuff that happens later. And it's just really interesting the way that it is such a kind of almost supernatural, preternatural introduction to this. Yeah. And obviously one of the things that Jane Eyre was accused of being when it was first published was anti-Christian. The publisher was anti-Christian. I think this is doing is essentially looking into those kinds of occurrences that do happen in the Bible, and specifically with dreams, and the way that throughout the Hebrew Bible and the New Testament there are occasions again and again where dreams are really important, and being able to read dreams and being able to read dreams accurately, or seeing dreams as important signs potentially of doom, or as warnings are really important. Actually, rather than this being a kind of, yes, it is a supernatural element, it's introducing an idea of superstition and folktale and all of that kind of stuff, but it's also kind of coming from from a biblical space of dreams and the importance of dreams. Yeah, I just think it's really interesting.
That word presentiments, for anyone who might not be that familiar with that word, an intuitive feeling about the future or expectation or mental impression of something about to happen. And then to tie it in with sympathies, that kind of affinity between certain things or people, and then signs as in omens or portents, kind of meaning of signs. And that Jane's really sees the world as this place of, we're not only connected literally physically with each other, but there are kind of supernatural connections that, and then signs or even connect us with the natural world too, not even just with people, that we're all this, it's this what's the I was trying to think of the Lion King word for the but everybody circle of life, thank you. But we're all connected to everything and each other, and this is what Jane's looking for too, in a sense too, in her life, isn't it? Connections, to find someone and to find people to be connected to, what she was deprived of as a child.
This idea is such a, it goes back really strongly to sensibility, and you get this a lot kind of in that early romantic period of this idea that everything is connected through sublimity, and that you can have an intense feeling of connection with someone, and that's where your feeling of dread comes from, and that's where often in the Gothic, the coincidences that you're like, well, that can't possibly happen, is explained because it's like, oh, well, these two people, they're secretly related, which means they're drawn to one another. Like, they are connected to one another, they have shared impulses. And you have scenes where people, even in the explained supernatural, have these experiences that we would think to be supernatural, which I think sometimes, like Mary said, this novel was branded Jacobin and unchristian, but this is very much on par with this very spiritual Christianity that was coming out of movements like Romanticism and sensibility. And I don't think it's any surprise that when we look at timelines, we're starting to get these movements that, we're interested in spiritualism, we're interested in ideas of energies. We're starting to get these kind of like little off branches of Christian sects and cults around prophets and prophetesses. And this is a period of time where, again, post-war, it happens quite often. You have this big explosion of like, oh, well, the world didn't end. And, the revolution happened and the war happened. And what does that mean? What comes next? In the same way that you have it kind of post-World War II, but very much in the 19th century, it's that expansion, not only of empire and exploration physically, but ideology and spiritually as well.
It's also, there's also some of there's also this is kind of a setup for, as Mary hinted to, it's something that will happen later in the novel, that the sympathies between far distant, long absent, wholly estranged relatives, that when we get to that point in the novel, when this kind of thing happens, I've encountered people who read Jane and say that could never happen, that I don't believe that, but she set it up early. She set it up already, that she believes in this kind of connection that she'll have with Rochester, in the future. But we will get into, I'd only mention it now because I want everybody to be ready for it and remember this, and then we'll bring it up later. So,
and it's so clearly hinted at. She's laying the groundwork, especially now, and even in this paragraph, it's hinting back to, I think we were talking about where she mentioned omens before in relation to Bertha. So these ideas, you know, there's all these threads, there's all these threads, and especially when you reread them, you can pick them out. It's really well done, I think.
Yeah.
Well, she
Even
continues here
about
too.
stuff like with Helen.
What was that about?
You know, with when she talks about Helen and Helen dying, and you know, this idea of spiritualism, and I always think of, I don't know if you guys are familiar with Margaret Atwood's Alias Grace. It was like a really key thing in that, where there's this idea like, oh well, the window didn't get let open for the spirit and things like that. Like it's not saying, oh well, this person, like, it's not saying, oh, there is an afterlife, oh yeah, there's definitely supernatural, oh yeah, there's definitely all of this stuff. It's just this kind of acknowledgement that within Jane's Christianity there is space for this intense empathy. And the stuff that she kind of takes from Helen sort of like reinforces that. I think the way that she's described as, you know, at peace, and what Helen believes about her own death and things like that, you know, it's set up right at the beginning of this fundamental childhood experience that will shape Jane as an adult, and then it's reinforced so that when you get to that point of the novel, you're like, oh, okay, I see why this would happen in Jane's head, in reality, however you choose to read it.
Well, she intensifies it here, this idea of, you know, signs with her dreams now, and the dream of children. Dream of children was a sure sign of trouble either to oneself or one's kin. And then she has this dream of an infant, which I sometimes hushed in my arms, sometimes dandled on my knee, sometimes watched playing with daisies on the lawn, or again dabbling its hands in running water. It was a wailing child this night and a laughing one the next, nestled close to me, and now it ran from me. This companionship, she says, with this baby phantom, which she had been, you know, having dreaming about. Yeah, when she was awakened by Mason being attacked, even. This her dream of her nurturing, but it's so nurturing too. Like she mentions once the child's wailing, but it's mostly her nurturing a child. And then she gets the news that, you know, someone's dying. But if that's the case, if she talks about, I'm sorry, in the beginning she talks about Betsy and Martha Abbott, the old servants from Gateshead, talking about, you know, you hear then somebody, you know, another child, like dream of a child, and then a child dies. What does that say about what's happening at the end of this chapter then? Because what she discovers is Mrs. Reed dying, and I almost think, I mean, I almost wonder if Charlotte Bronte is kind of putting it like Jane is the child in the dream, in a sense, like that's what she's. I don't know. There's no child dying that she finds out. She finds out it's Mrs. Reed dying. So, but that doesn't line up with what she said this dream would represent. And why bring that up if she's not trying to tie it in?
Just as ill omen. I'd not really connected that, but also because we would say, when we say little sister, I say little sister. My sister's 29. Yeah. So when I've read it, I've just kind of, you know, Bessie's young at the start of the novel, but she's not, you know, so I've not necessarily gone, that's a child. Now, whether or not little would be used in that way, I actually would suspect it probably wouldn't, but I've just realized that I've never read it like that. I've just assumed it was like a teenage or younger.
Yeah, no, you're right.
Because to me, little sister just means the sister that is younger than I am, but obviously, like, it could mean physically.
It's also weird. Like, I've never heard of this outside of this book. Dream of children means somebody's got, really? Like, oh my God, I dream of my kids all the time, you know?
I think the superstition is if you don't have children and you dream of children. It's not if you dream of your children. It's if you dream of children and you don't have children. I think that it's supposed to be an ill omen. I don't know. I feel like it's a pretty common dream that women have.
I mean, it's also connecting the idea of, women and childbirth specifically with death, which is quite a common literary trope anyway. You can go back to, Genesis and, the idea of Eve and transgression and transgression. And so I think it's potentially just that. But I mean, in terms of like interpreting dreams, what's the one that I always have is that my teeth are falling out, and it's meant to be, about money. And I've never understood how that connects, but I think sometimes there is something like that, a kind of almost a dream-like, not making sense of things, where things connect in weird ways.
It's like the tarot inversion thing as well, isn't it? There's an element of, if you dream of an infant, that represents death, it doesn't represent life. And if you sometimes a dream about death can represent birth and things like that. So I think there's that kind of like flipped aspect of it as well,
because we're not in an age yet when she's writing this where dreams are necessarily interpreted as anxieties or desires. That's very 20th. That's really post-Freud. That's 20th century. Because I would see this dream, I'm still like, yeah, you want to have children, and you're taking care of Adele, so of course this is all going to translate into your mind as you taking care of a child. But that's not this world that we're in.
No, it's still dreams very much, even in post-Enlightenment, are still, it's one of those kind of pervasive folklorish elements, particularly in the north of England, and in rural areas like Cornwall. If you were to say, oh, I had a dream of such and such, it'd be like, oh, it's gonna, like, if you're pregnant and you have a dream, it's like, oh, well, that means it's gonna be a boy. It's still very, like, this is still very much a period where dreams are seen as being some kind of omen or some kind of understanding, because we're still too early in our understanding of the idea of a psyche. And it also, as I said, it also goes back to the Bible. You've got Joseph, Joseph who is important separate dreams, and Joseph in the Hebrew Bible in Genesis, who interprets the dream of Pharaoh and is rejected by his family, all that kind of stuff. And then you also have Joseph in the New Testament, specifically Matthew, I think, where he has quite a few dreams that relate to one, yes, your wife is pregnant of the Lord, and then another one being like, Herod's going to kill all these people, you need to get out of here. Then another one being like, it's safe, you can go back. And then another, I think he has 4 dreams, and I think the last one is like, actually no, it's not safe, maybe go somewhere else. So dreams are really important in the Bible and in Christianity as being omens or perhaps warnings, and connecting your kind of your unconscious perhaps with God and something else. I think it's
And for here, then, the sign and the connection with Jane having this dream is connecting her back to Gateshead and Mrs. Reed and her connection with that family, with her cousins. Well, with her family, I say that family. It's actually her family that she is connected with. And then and this is what happens. Then Robert shows up, Bessie's husband, shows up, dressed in mourning. So there's like a big warning for her. Somebody comes, now is arriving to see her dressed in mourning. We find out he was nice to her when she was a child. Someone else was nice to her at the house. He used to give her a ride sometimes on Miss Georgiana's pony. And then he gives her, kind of the gossip too. What's going on? They're really bad. They're in great trouble. Mr. John has died now. Not only, had we heard that, he was a rake and no good, but now he's dead because of it. His life's been very wild. Gave himself up to strange ways. And he ran into debt. In jail, his mother had to keep bailing him out and giving him more money. And then it's interesting because they'll still, it's not his fault. His head was not strong. Other people, knaves he lived amongst, fooled him. It's not that he was a bad guy. It was that he was around all these bad guys. I mean, and this is something that frequently happens with, people, and their children. And it was the companions. So I was always the companion, though. So sorry. I was the one that parents blamed. So
me too.
Yeah. But for him, he's also killed himself. And then this causes Mrs. Reed to finally break down and it seems like have a stroke. Is what seems to be happening. But it's also the loss of money and fear of poverty were quite breaking her down. So this is just the death of her son is just kind of the last straw. But another big fear of her is this fear of poverty that has happened. And she has asked to fetch Jane Eyre. I want to speak to her. Very unusual that, I think at this moment in the novel that why would she want to speak to Jane? But she does.
I think the fact that that's framed immediately before the possibility that John has killed himself and taken his own life, and that this has been a novel from the beginning very interested in the difference between nature and nurture, and whether or not somebody's inherent nature can be shaped, and that yes, this is a very heavily Protestant country by this point in time, but you do still get a lot of like hangovers from centuries of Catholicism, and deathbed confessions and things like that are still they're still quite common, particularly in the in the Victorian period, in the Victorian novel, because there's so much increased interest about life after death and morality. We have a massive return of Memento Mori, that I always kind of read this as like she's not only worried about living in poverty, but that kind of thing of like, oh well, it was companions, and that was he raised right, and if your child commits suicide, does the sin also lie with you? That I think you get this kind of like, and we see this in a few pages, desperation from Mrs. Reed that we know why she wants to talk to Jane to an extent. We know that Jane was mistreated, and I think it doesn't shock us to a certain extent that we see that we see the fact that she wants Jane to come back, and that the girls don't understand it and they put it off at first.
Oh yeah, they don't want it.
They don't want it, they don't understand it. But I think there's also an element of, we've just had this whole thing about dreams, we've just had this thing about connections, and I don't think I think we can kind of also maybe assume that Mrs. Reed is perhaps plagued of dreams of Jane, or that she's having this intense feeling because, as we find out later, if she dies without telling Jane, Jane's probably never going to know. So that, and it has to happen. And I think it's not the only reason that Jane has that dream and talks about that just before this happens, because if she thinks it happens to her, we can intuit that within the realm of the novel it happens to everybody else as well to a certain extent. And that's kind of, I've always kind of seen it.
And I'm interested in Jane's reaction in that, in the words she uses, it seems to me that I ought to go, that it is a kind of duty to her, that it's an obligation to her, that she needs to grant this wish. And that's how she approaches it. And we'll get into more of that as she's there, and how she winds up being the caretaker of her hated aunt, or she doesn't hate her anymore. We'll get into that. So the aunt still hates her. She goes off to in search of Mr. Rochester, which could be, this kind of, this could be the subtitle of this novel for Jane anyway. That's the docu series going on in Jane's life right now, In Search of Mr. Rochester. Who really is he? I just love the details in this. Not that it's even important, but he's not in the lower rooms. He's not in the yard. I just like the idea she's walking all around looking for him, and that is the kind of the psychological thing that's going on in this book. And I asked Mrs. Fairfax if she had seen him. Yes, he was playing billiards with Miss Ingram. Of course he's with Miss Ingram. And as she walks into the room, the ever insufferable Blanche, the ever haughty Blanche here, she looked at me haughtily. Her eyes seemed to demand, "What can the creeping creature want now?" and then she tries to totally block her, like just like not let her see him or talk to him. And then she finally says, "Does that person want you?" And then he just like runs out of the room with her. He made a curious grimace first, one of his strange and equivocal demonstrations, threw down his cue and followed me from the room. So he's certainly going to, and this is the first time I think she's done this with him in that group, is to come up to talk to him. And in one sense, I'm thinking he's got to be thinking like, finally, you're like coming in to talk to me when I'm with everyone. And it's only to leave. Permission to leave.
Especially because he leans back against the door. That's such a like nonchalant main character in a movie thing to do.
And then go ahead.
Just feels really modern. That moment always strikes me as like really modern. Like it's almost like it's such a good observation, because that's exactly what I would expect someone to do if this was a TV show or a film. That bit just always really strikes me, that he's like, "Oh yeah, okay, well, Jane." She's like, "Yeah, I'm going."
And then we find out more. Well, he finds out more about her that he has never known, and it didn't dawn on me that he doesn't know this story about her life until this moment in the book. That the Reeds, and he's heard of the Reeds, and he kind of knows the family, but he doesn't know that she is related to them. And then she says, his wife cast me off because I was poor and burdensome, and she disliked me. I love her. Very blunt, like, well, I didn't have any money and I was a problem, and she hated me. Like, that's why she got rid of me. She's being very honest about this. He knows of the family. He knows about John. He knows about Georgiana, just from society gossip. And then when Jane says she's going to leave, he's, like, he can't imagine that. He's more like me. I'd be like, are you kidding me? I'm not going back to see her. She can write me a letter that I probably won't even read. But she's, she could not be easy to neglect her wishes now, Jane says. And then he's demanding that, like, only now he's terrified she's going to leave and not come back. Only promise to only stay a week. At all events, you will come back, making sure that, she's not going to stay away too long. And then the whole exchange with the money, which I think is very funny. I don't know. I mean, it's teasing definitely, but I think it's pretty funny when, he's giving her money and, like, oh no, you can't take that much. It's too much. You'll stay away. Give me back. And then they got to negotiate wages. And now you owe me $5. She says to him, come back for it. I'm your banker. I like this kind of exchange between them. It shows that there's, it's not just all sententious and, passionate and fear and anxiety between the two of them. They can still have these kind of light little moments here. And then she brings up the sore point, though. But you're going to shortly be married. And then it asked about Adele, and his response is, well, to get her out of my bride's way, who might otherwise walk over her rather too emphatically. There's sense in that suggestion, and you, of course, much march straight to the devil, he says to her, which I don't think it means she's going to go bad. It's like she's going to, like, leave him. She's going to, like, get out of his life, abandon him by going, to the devil. And then his response is so interesting here, and this kind of to make sure she doesn't leave, to consult him before she advertises, because of course he has a plan, right? He said this. Well, I think it was a chapter was last week. This is what one of the things that he said as when he comes out of pretending to be the old woman. Then he talks about, I have a plan, and this is his plan. He is planning on getting married. I am planning on getting married, Jane. And she doesn't like catch on to you. We've had so much, kind of, and not that he hasn't deserved a good bit of it, so much of this kind of Rochester hate in the show, and especially in the chat. But it's a scene like this that I'm just torn. Like, I'm torn between him manipulating and also finding it amusing, like finding it playful. I don't know. How do you guys make his clearly manipulative way of talking to her and working out these situations, and yet it's still being playful? Am I just being fooled by Charlotte Bronte too, that this is, her writing this character well?
It's tough because you are supposed to think that he is charming in his way. That he's not a gallant, he's not particularly chivalric, but you are supposed to find him charming. And part of the charm is supposed to be that he's a bit grumpy, and he's not, he is a great conversationalist, but he's not particularly polite. And I think, there's that element of what you're supposed to read is that he has too much pride. Bear in mind that, and this is one of my biggest bugbears, and I hated this the entire time I worked there, people buy merchandise with Mr. Darcy's first proposal on it, where he says to her, "You're poor and I hate your family, but you're hot and I can't control myself. Please marry me, because that's the only way that I can get past this." And people buy things with that. They write it as love quote. They think that is a romantic moment.
It's the first line of that, though. It's like, I cannot live without you kind of line. But then he goes and qualifies it by saying why he can't live without her. And it's awful.
Oh my God. Yeah. Shut up. It's the worst. And you are supposed to be like Elizabeth. There's a great edit where someone's like edited a hip hop song over it, and like when she gives him the rebuttal, it like drops, so it's like Mr. Darcy getting destroyed or something. It's on YouTube, you'll find it really easily. It's fantastic. But it's not supposed to be romantic. You are supposed to be like, oh, cringe, that's not cool, because Lizzie doesn't like him yet, and you're not supposed to like him yet either. You are supposed to like Rochester, and I think what you're supposed to be seeing is him, a man of status, a man of wealth, attempting to navigate a situation he is not used to. And that's why he makes these concessions to her. That's why Bronte is very clear to add in these moments where he respects her in ways that other people don't respect her. That's why they introduce characters like, that's why you have the Ingrams. That's why you have these visitors, because you need to demonstrate reinforce how other people treat Jane, to demonstrate the difference in the way Rochester does. I don't think we're supposed to romanticize it and be like, oh, isn't that fantastic that he like plays, he doesn't tell her it's her. But how is a man of status and wealth supposed to admit to his governess that he wants to marry her? There is that element of it. He almost wants her. He's just really crap at flirting. He wants her to pick it up so that he doesn't have to say it himself. And it's almost, she kind of gets it. And she's like, no, you say it. I'm not going to save you from this situation. Like, you take control of your feelings and like say it to me in person. So I don't think it's necessarily supposed to be charming, but I think we are supposed to read this as two people attempting to get to know each other and navigate one another in a way that we find endearing. I wouldn't expect this of, I don't want to see this in my 2021 rom-com. And I think the thing is, like, it's intentional. It, like with Austen, the things that make him problematic are intentional, and we see him get his just rewards for the things about him that are problematic. He is not permitted to marry her unless he learns about himself, and I do think that that's the difference here, is that he's having this learning experience alongside her, but Jane's telling the novel, so we don't see that firsthand,
because we're very aware that she doesn't know he loves her yet. Like, she's not aware of that yet, and so I think, but we could probably also assume that he's probably thinking the same thing, that like, I don't know if you do love me, and he's trying to find out.
She's playing with him. We've been with Jane from the beginning of the novel. Rochester hasn't, and he's never seen her with another man. He's got absolutely, not only is he bad at flirting and she's bad at picking it up, he also doesn't know what she's like in other situations. So, you know, he's kind of doing that thing where he's like testing the waters, and she doesn't really give him that much back. Only the reader gets these impassioned, kind of heartfelt descriptions of him. To his face, she's like, yeah, okay, bye.
Yeah.
Like, see you later. But I do think there is, you know, I'm not saying he's far from perfect.
I'll promise you anything, sir, that I am likely to perform. Like that's not what I asked.
Yeah, she's not like, I don't want to leave, I don't want to be that away from you, don't worry, I'll rush back to you. She's like, it might be longer, I don't know. Like, I can't tell you that. I'm not going to tell you that.
Well, we do have oh, go ahead, Mary.
I was just going to say, it's also a really interesting moment where he learns things about her that he hadn't known, and perhaps might change his thoughts about how he considers her. You know, up until this point, she has been Jane, the orphan who has no family connections, and now he finds out that she does have family connections, and also that they're more in his kind of circles, or almost adjacent to his circles. And obviously, you know, he's been with Blanche and everyone else for a while now, and they've clearly been talking about perhaps the suicide of Mr. John Reed, quite a bit of gossip, and also perhaps, you know, Georgiana, who came out into society a few seasons ago, and he's now trying to put the puzzle pieces together of, oh, Jane isn't who I thought she was exactly, and also family connections. Does that mean she has money? And up until this point, you know, she's a poor governess who's completely reliant on her, which also kind of, you know, reframes that, you know, that playful conversation about money, where he doesn't want to give her too much. You know, he wants her to come back, if only for the money. And it's just really, it's just really interesting. Change and reaction from Mr. Rochester, which I think you're meant to see it as playful, not exactly charming, but not I guess as a modern reader we do come to it. We do come to it with kind of like, what's this? These are her wages, just give her wages and be done with it. But obviously there's, you know, other kinds of things going on.
We do have a very modern rom-com moment at the end of this, though, where they have this very awkward farewell.
It also shows as well, which just occurred to me while Mary was talking, that he has assumed that he knows basically everything about her, and he's the one with the information to keep close to his chest. And I think it shocks him that she's so nonchalantly is like, oh yeah, no, I had an aunt, she hates me, I was burdensome, they sent me away. And that, you know, she's just not told him. She's not told him this really important thing about who she is and her family. And he might never have known if she hadn't have had this, you know, visitor. And I think that's kind of like shakes him as well, that there's parts of her that he doesn't know, and that she's kept secrets more effortlessly than he has kept secrets from her.
All righty. We have a lot of the chapter to get to, and I blew right past the mid-break here. So let me tell everybody that we bring Sundays with Jane Eyre to you for free. So if you'd like to support the Rosenbach through donation, you can do that at our website. Since this novel was published in 1847, we're asking for donations of $18.47 to support the show. Donations go directly toward keeping this show free and accessible to everyone. And I want to thank people who donated in the last week: Autumn C. from Bala Kinwood, Heather S. from Toledo, Ohio, Jana B. from North Hollywood, California, Jeffrey B. from Philadelphia, and Julia M. from Coburg, Germany. Thank you. And there have been lots more that donated, but these people are also on our registration list. So I wanted to, for the Jane Eyre registration list, so I wanted to thank them. But you could also become a member of the Rosenbach, like Mary S. from Fredericksburg, Virginia, Marie O. from Boston, Massachusetts, and Adrian P. from Amberieu, Ambougie, France. So I know Adrian. Thanks for joining up again, Adrian. That's so nice. And Jacqueline C. from Cherry Hill, New Jersey. I'm so happy you all have joined the Rosenbach as members. Members of the Rosenbach get free and exclusive access to some programs, 10% off of any of our reading courses, 50% off of any paid Rosenbach programs. And we have lots of great programs and courses coming up. They're all online. The January to March are all online now. We have a virtual course that's a poetry workshop with Gabrielle Bates called The Poetic Image that starts this week. We have a virtual course with Jane Austen, Sense and Sensibility with your friend, Dr. Kathleen Hudson. And there's a virtual course with Samuel Beckett. What else do we have? We have a virtual course called The Clearing, the Multidimensional Legacy of Toni Morrison. An in-person course with on the lives of early American women and Victorian voices. We have an in-person course reading 1922, all the literary works that came out then. We have a virtual course on Aubrey Beardsley and the Decadence starting in March, and a virtual course called Jules Verne's Scientific Imagination, and that's going to be taught by Anastasia Klimchinskaya, who is one of our co-hosts for Frankenstein, and looking forward to that one exceptionally. I'm very much looking forward to that. That's the course that I'll be into. I'll be reading along like I did with you guys with Gothic mostly. Upcoming co-hosts on the show are Kathleen Hudson will come back next week, and then she'll be joining us like you guys once a month. Kathleen's going to join us now once a month. It'll be the week following you. She's going to join us once a month on January 20th. So
exciting.
Yeah, she's really great, and I'm happy to have her on repeatedly now. And then on January 23rd, Adele Hay is going to join us. She is the author of Anne Bronte Reimagined. On the 30th of January, Fionnuala Austin, author of Bronte's Mistress, is going to return. And then on February 6th, Dr. Claire O'Callaghan, author of Emily Bronte Reappraised, is going to be on. So we got the three authors who, for the publisher Saraband, who have done Charlotte Bronte in Sophie Franklin has been on the show and will return, and Claire O'Callaghan doing Emily Bronte, and Adele Hay doing Anne Bronte, those three books. So it'll be nice to have all those authors on the show. And back to the book. Jane goes to Gateshead 5 o'clock in the afternoon on the 1st of May. I love when books give us dates, because then I can put them on my literary calendar. And this is the date that Jane returned to Gateshead. Betsy's there with her children. She has this nice little reunion with Betsy. Tells her the Mrs. Reed was just asking if she was coming, again. Old times crowded fast back on me as I watched her bustling about. This is Jane talking about Betsy, and they have their tea. Betsy serves her, and Jane Betsy really treats her like the lady that she has become, as she did when she last met her before she left Lowood. And she tells her about Rochester. I told her he was rather an ugly man, but quite a gentleman. Jane is relentless in telling people and telling the reader over and over again that Rochester is ugly, and that he treated me kindly and I was content. And this is also her way of deflecting, isn't it? I mean, her way of saying, well, he's ugly, so please don't ship us because he's ugly. And this is what she's always telling people. And then she describes the gay company that they had there, and that's what Betsy really likes to hear. Betsy's she's she's a downstairs servant that just wants to hear all the, you know, fun things that the people upstairs do. And then she goes into the house, and she begins it with this kind of, you know, almost gothic presentiment here. On a dark, misty, raw morning in January, is her thinking about in the past when she left. You know, I had left a hostile roof with a desperate and embittered heart, a sense of outlawry and almost of reprobation to seek the chilly harborage of Lowood. I love the outlawry that she imagines herself as a child, that she's really like done something wrong, and it's a little fanciful. It's her reimagining her childhood as, you know, as the hero heroine of a novel that she has read as well.
Yeah, she's also doing that very gothic thing of personifying a house. Houses, you know, take on their master's characteristics, or take on the, you know, the energy that's kind of been spent in them and things like that. So having this moment, you know, it harks back to, you know, when she first meets Rochester, to, you know, when she thinks about Betsy's stories. You know, she's still doing this even as she's growing up and maturing.
Wait a minute, I was just asked a question here and I didn't catch it either. She named her child Jane. Betsy names her child Jane. Did I miss that? Nikki just asked
little
that.
Jane and little Robert.
That Nikki just asked that. Why doesn't she bat an eyelash that Betsy's named her daughter Jane? Too common a name. And I'm like, what? I didn't even catch it myself.
I mean, the answer is kind of yes. It is a really common name, and obviously we don't know what Betsy's family are called. And I think Jane is not some, you know, our Jane Eyre is not someone who would assume that Betsy's named her daughter in her honor. Also, because you should have named your child after your mother or your sister. You know, that's what you're supposed to do. But it is a possibility that she chooses Jane because it also is Jane's name. But I think it's one of those things that Jane Eyre would just wouldn't occur to her. It wouldn't occur to her that somebody would do that. I like to think it's because of her, though. It makes me happy.
I know. I like
that.
Betsy
really loves her.
So, you know, I hadn't even noticed it. So there we go. Thank you, Nikki, for pointing that out. You mentioned in the house and what it represents to her as a child, and then we have this little bit from Jane too. Now, she talks about my prospects were doubtful yet, meaning her life and what she's going to do, and I had yet an aching heart. I still felt as a wanderer on the face of the earth, but I experienced firmer trust in myself and my own powers, and less withering dread of oppression. The gaping wound of my wrongs, too, was now quite healed, and the flame of resentment extinguished. She trusts herself now. This is the first. I mean, the first time that we've really been told that she doesn't blame them anymore. She's not, you know, she's not dwelling on this, you know, hurt childhood, and he's no longer hurting for how she was treated. And Gateshead, though, hasn't changed a bit. So she's faced with this, like, I'm a changed person and I'm returning to this place, and none of you have changed. So you're all still just miserable. And even the rug is the same rug that Mr. Brocklehurst stood on. But the books are still there, the Bedwick's British Birds and her Gulliver's Travels and Arabian Nights. And Eliza and Georgiana are there. Georgiana seems the same, but Eliza is certainly, you know, very, you know, kind of more, you know, severe now, and has changed, but not for good. She's still the same in her selfishness, as we'll get to in a bit. But and I have a question from Adam that I want to hit in a minute. About Eliza, with her nun-like ornament of a string of ebony beads and a crucifix around her neck. I mean, that's very telling for what Charlotte Bronte might want to tell us about this character. She's Catholic, Well, she's not, but she certainly seems like a Catholic, and that is not a good thing.
Maybe she's Anglican.
There you go. That's not a good thing in Charlotte Bronte's experience of her life, especially, you know, when she went to Brussels and had to live with all the Catholics. So, but Georgiana is still the very plump damsel, fair as waxwork. And I love this description of Eliza, the thin and pallid elder daughter had her parents' cairngorm eye. And my notes in a couple of books mention that it's a stone, and I looked it up, and it's a precious stone of yellow or wine color consisting of rock crystal colored by oxide of iron. It's used in brooches and seals, and ornamenting the handles of dirks and other articles of Highland costume. And I was just like, yeah. I still didn't get that, but then it's a mountain range, and that's when it all clicked for me. It's a mountain range.
It's an area.
The eastern Highlands of Scotland, and that's the cold gray thing that she's referring to. That's what she really means by cairngorm, because Mrs. Reed's eyes are described as severe, usually cold, gray, devoid of ruth, eye of ice. And that's the descriptions that we've had already of Mrs. Reed's eye. And that's the eye that Eliza has.
Yeah, because it's really interesting. Like when you drive through the Highlands, like on the one side, you have beautiful greenery, like where Brockness and everything is. It's very beautiful. It's very lush. You have these sweeping landscapes, but it's very nice to look at. It's very, you kind of get that fairy tale aspect. When you then drive out towards the cairngorms and you look over the other side, you've got these harsh, kind of rugged, weather-beaten, devoid landscapes. And I don't know if Bronte would necessarily have known that, but I always think of that, like I've done that drive, and it's a very strange experience, because on one side you've got this beautiful scenery that conjures, so much in like literature and culture and imagination, and then the other side you think, God, nothing grows, everything's very bleak, it's very sparse, it's very grey, and it's a really powerful image. When you think of the Cairngorms as a region. And I think, it's definitely referring to that kind of that harshness and that it is grey. There's like no colour on it.
The Eliza and Georgiana don't treat her well, of course. And I'm going to get back to Eliza later because I have a good question from Adam that I want to get to and talking about Eliza's character here. But for now, they're just being mean to her. As young ladies have a remarkable way of letting you know that they think you a quiz without actually saying the words. Charlotte had these experiences, in the schools that she attended with the other, young women not treating her well. I think she's pulling that in here with her comment of how these young women behave towards people. But I want to get, they of course try to block her from seeing their mother, and she just goes to Betsy, and she's taking control. She really takes control of the situation. She's not going to wait. They say, I doubt you can see her. And she's just like, well, if you want to tell her. And then she's like, oh no, she doesn't want to be disturbed. And she's like, all right, I'm just going to go and tell Betsy then to, announce me. And she takes care of it herself. And right away she's thinking, I had taken a journey of 100 miles to see my aunt, and I must stay with her till she was better. She's already decided, well, you need somebody with some compassion in this house to deal with this woman, so I better stay. She goes up to Mrs. Reed's room, where again she has these kind of flashbacks to being a child, especially when she sees the once dreaded switch, which used to lurk. Oh, well, she expected to see the switch, which used to lurk there, which means that she did see it in her mind, at least, being there. And but time, it is a happy thing, she says, that time quells the longings of vengeance and hushes the promptings of rage and aversion. Now she has no other emotion than a sort of ruth for her great sufferings, Mrs. Reed's sufferings, and a strong yearning to forget and forgive all injuries, to be reconciled and clasp hands in amity. Tracy commented here, I think forgiveness is definitely one of the big themes of Jane Eyre, and in this chapter shows how she has learned to forgive. She does. She is, but I find that this is more than just, Jane being the good, pious, Christian. This seems really so character based with her by this point in the novel. Mary, you're nodding.
I think it's just that's how much Jane's grown, and she says she doesn't need to have any she doesn't have any need for vengeance or to get revenge, and I think it is coming from her. She wants to forgive, and this is something that she can do, and it's not necessarily that she needs anything from any of these people, but she's happy to forgive and to get I think closure. She comes all this way and she won't leave until Mrs. Reed is better or dead, and I think she just needs to know that she will have some closure, whatever that means for anyone else. That's fine, but in terms of Jane's fine and she's happy, and forgiveness is part of that, washing away her kind of like vengeances and little kinds of things that were sticking with her.
But it's Mrs. Reed, and she still has the eye which nothing could melt, and Jane goes to hold her hand and she pulls it away, her stony eye. I mean, and Jane's all about physiognomy, so like whatever this is, she's reading your character and how you look, and this eye just keeps coming up over and over again. If we were deconstructionists, we'd be talking about Foucault and this eye of surveillance that Mrs. Reed had when she was a child, and how this continued, but I don't go there.
But it is in a way, it's like Jane's giving over the kind of power that Mrs. Reed had over her as a child. She had a lot of power because she was an adult and because she was her guardian, and you can see the vestiges of that essentially through the way that she imagines the switch. It haunts her recollection, and it's essentially as much there as it's not, but she's relinquishing that control, and Mrs. Reed can be as cold and hard as she wants, but Jane's fine. Jane's moved on.
And it's not all simple, like, oh, I forgive you. She's honest about, I felt pain, and then I felt ire, and then I felt a determination to subdue her, to be her mistress in spite of both her nature and her will. I mean, very honest, admit that, like, oh yeah, I'm gonna conquer you, lady, as you conquered me. She admits that she feels those things, but then is nothing but compassionate with her.
Well, she's there for herself as well, isn't she? She's not there for Mrs. Reed's benediction. She's there because she wants not necessarily to forgive, but to acknowledge how far she's come. This whole sequence at the house, this whole thing at Gateshead is, I am no longer that child Jane Eyre, and as much as you tried to put me down, I have still fended for myself. Like, I have a job and I am educated and I am my own person, and I'd rather be my own person in my own terms than anything, than have had you love me or whatever it may be. And I think you do get that kind of like, she's able to be compassionate because she recognizes that she's now superior, that she has power over her, and that partially comes from a better person.
Say that partially comes from what? You drop right there. Partially comes from...
that Jane is a quote unquote a better person. She's a better person than Mrs. Reed, and it doesn't harm her to give her that compassion. She can acknowledge that pain that she still feels, and she's not going to be like weeping by her bedside necessarily, but you know, like Mary said, Jane's fine. She, you know, it doesn't bother her. It's beneath her. You know, she can do the right thing, not because she's pious, but because she has the power, and she's not going to be like they were when they had power. You know, she's going to be fair and just where they were cruel. And it is still kind of, you know, it's that kind of, you know, it's not that kind of forgiveness that makes you like scream at the TV. It's that kind of forgiveness where you're like, yeah, okay. I can see this. Like, you would have always wondered if you've not gone, and you've gone and you've had that closure and you're able to take power. I think it's quite an interesting moment in terms of the idea of forgiveness and piousness.
And that she's doing it for herself as well, that it's about her, you know, self. And I mean, we even have the line here, I am Jane Eyre. You know, are you Jane Eyre? I am Jane Eyre. I mean, she's asserting herself and her being, and this is who I am. Of course, you know, and Mrs. Reed is just, you know, still a mess, and then doesn't quite realize that it's her, but she's talking about her in the third person, and then she's just still, you know, boiling over with hate and herself, the way she describes Jane and how she hated her and she was a burden on her and how she was left to her. She talked to me once like something mad or like a fiend. No child ever spoke or looked as she did. I mean, remember that early scene where she terrifies Aunt Reed by the way she responds to her. And then she says, I wish she had died in the fever at Lowood. And Jane's playing this up. Why do you hate her so? And she gives her reasons, because she hated her mother, because she married, you know, because her brother married beneath him to marry her, and it was a low marriage. And then her husband loved Jane as a baby more than he loved my own children or his own children. And then it bleeds over into John, you know, her own son. This is a really well written, you know, I think, portrait of her head and how the kind of all this comes out, and then, but especially because then it's connected with her own children. And that's very insightful for, I think, Charlotte Bronte to add to this part of her talking here, blurting all this out. And she doesn't quite realize in the state still that John is dead yet. It's just that he's in great trouble, but she dreams of him being dead, which of course she's probably, she has already been told that he is. And just this bitter, awful woman that Jane is.
I think
go ahead.
Just a real class anxiety, and a kind of a fear and an embarrassment of being poor, and how that manifests and grows, and, you know, almost like a disease infects everything connected from Mrs. Reed's perspective with her connection to poverty. She's embarrassed connections to someone who is poor, and she's embarrassed that then, you know, her husband wants to look after this poor orphan. And I think it's really interesting that she says, I would have soon been charged with a pauper brat out of a workhouse, because that child wouldn't have any relation to her, marital or otherwise, but the brain connects Mrs. Reed to poverty, and that for her is such a massive anxiety and fear, and then that also transfers into jealousy over her husband's affections for their children. Why is my husband paying so much attention and giving so much love and affection to Jane, who is poor, as opposed to our children? And it just manifests this massive resentment, because it's not talked about really. It's not, she never ever says, I hate Jane because she's poor, but that's essentially what it boils down to. And I just think it's another really interesting passage.
And also connected too with her son John, then, who is causing the whole family to become poor now with the way he's, you know, spent their whole fortune.
Exactly.
And it recommends, it's not just the anxiety about her closeness to poverty, it's the way that she's tainted herself. And it's so interesting that she's like, he is a Gibson, like my son's a Gibson, because clearly being, being related to to this family, being the Reeds, is they're weak. They are sympathetic with the poor, and they don't value class structure. He was weak for it. He cried over his sister like a simpleton, and he didn't punish her as he should have done, and he took the child in, and he loved the child more than our children. I've polluted my bloodline with this man. Mm-hmm. And Jane represents the pollution of that bloodline, and I cannot allow anybody to know that, and for that child to have influence over my children so that they won't be further polluted. And that, again, going back to things like I can never say it. Physiognomy. I'm not going to try.
Physiognomy.
Thank you. That's such a key thing in this text, and that's essentially what she's getting at. Is Jane is the representation of the pollution of my bloodline. And I have to keep I wish she'd have died, because then I would never have had to acknowledge that she existed. My children could grow up free from her, and I'd never be connected to her.
And she's unaware of the irony of saying that her son John is quite like a Gibson like her. And of course, he's the worst of the bunch. I mean, he is completely depraved, and and winds up even killing himself over his over all this. So yeah, okay. Well, so that's all we get here for now with her. And then more than 10 days elapsed. I can't imagine 10 straight days of sitting with Eliza and Georgiana in this room, but she does, and she draws, and just even her descriptions of the drawings is again bringing me back to her descriptions of her watercolor paintings. Even what she draws. I don't know. We're running late on time, but I just love this. Lauren, do you want to read that paragraph there? Provided with a case of pencils.
I'm actually going to throw over to Mary because my throat is starting to hurt. I've been really poorly this weekend, so I've been saving myself for today.
Go ahead, Mary.
Okay. Provided with a case of pencils and some sheets of paper, I used to take a seat apart from them near the window and busy myself in sketching fancy vignettes, representing any scene that happened momentarily to shape itself in the ever-shifting kaleidoscope of imagination. A glimpse of sea between two rocks, crossing its disk, a group of reeds and water flags, a naiad's head crowned with lotus flowers rising. An elf sitting on a hedge sparrow's nest under a wreath of hawthorn bloom. It's just really fascinating and really, still showing how much her imagination and that kind of fantastical imagination plays on her art, and how she sees the world, and how she kind of daydreams through her paintings. And obviously, the ever-shifting coloration is such a wonderful description. But I also really love how it then goes into another painting that she draws, and how she says, I fell to sketching a face. What sort of face it was to be, I did not care or know, which I think when you get to the bottom of that paragraph, you're like, well, obviously you did care, and you were purposely sketching out Mr. Rock. I just think it's really funny because it's such a long paragraph where you get this rich description of a person, and you're like, this is Mr. Rochester, isn't it? This is obviously Mr. Rochester.
It's obvious that she's drawing it. It is.
It's so obvious. And then again, it's a very faithful representation of Mr. Rochester. And then Georgiana calls him an ugly man. That description. And it's showing, this page shows Jane's painter, both in kind of painting what's true and accurate and faithful, but also in terms of her imagination. But it's also showing, Mr. Rochester is ugly. It's just, Charlotte just needs to kind of emphasize that point again, which I just find hilarious.
Nikki says, is it significant that she spent so much of her time with the Reeds sitting at a window, that she's both there but not? she could fly away, she says.
Mhm.
So, well, she's not caged. Well, oh, I'm sorry, we haven't said that line yet. So, but yeah, but she is. She's, her drawings are escapist in the way that, that her imagination, but also in drawing Rochester, and because this is the, the connection that really is important to her right now. And it is funny that, even Georgiana says he's an ugly man. And I'm sure James like, yeah, he's an ugly man. But you have to look at him, don't you? He's compellingly ugly. And then she offers to sketch their portraits and does. This is the time they spend together. And now she really gets into especially describing Eliza and her, the clockwork regularity, she calls it, of the way she lives her life, but also the kind of, how it's all driven by this, devotional exercises all day long. And she describes her as, her piety is a kind of an ascetic piety, and seems very Catholic, and that it doesn't bring her any solace. And this is where I want to bring in this question from Adam that he had sent me about Eliza. Because he says, I was wondering about how Bronte intends her readers to understand Eliza's lifestyle choice. She is a villain, and she is not described in a particularly flattering way, either physically or how she evolved. My first reaction was the obvious one. She is just like a dull stone trying to get through the endless, boring days in as painless way as possible. Perhaps with a dose of OCD thrown in for good measure. But then I considered further, Adam writes, over a few days and came to a different, more charitable conclusion. It is not an uncommon concept in religious and especially in monastic communities that a very ordered, simple, regimented life is a useful tool for developing one's inner life. I might even applaud her rejection of the conventional aristocratic life of the time with its parties, socializing, etc., and its replacement with a simple contemplative life. I also appreciated she made her financial arrangements to secure her own independent livelihood. And he also says that was also something I really appreciated about Grace Poole as well. I know that Bronte constructed two sisters to contrast with each other, and I think Eliza comes off pretty good in the comparison. I might say that I would still tell Georgiana to go to hell, but I would wish Eliza Jane well. And wants to know what we think. Is she just a repressed, dull, uninteresting person, or is she someone who traded the frivolities of external life for a rich inner life? This is all a big question, but I wanted to get it all in there because it was a really well thought out observation and question about her. I was going to say go, but I was just going to, I think that. Well, I think that the independence and the self-will that she has to do all this is also very much her not being connected to people, and where it doesn't give her any solace, and it also doesn't help her, love her sister or anyone else any better. And so it's in a sense pointless.
I think that was a really great question and a lot of really great observations. I think for me, Jane returning to visit her cousins, they're both portrayed as being very selfish, but in different ways.
Yeah.
Contrast, but ultimately they are both selfish. And I think, we don't necessarily have to like them, but I think the adult versions aren't as bad as maybe they could have been. And Jane's fine to just let them be. And I think you find out later what happens to both of them, and they're both fine, and they go on and they're both fine and they go on and live their life. They have a kind of contentment as much as they can. I don't really want to say happy, but yeah, for Eliza, I guess specifically in Gothic novels, the kind of convent and becoming a nun wasn't always seen as a bad thing. So convents were places of, there were specifically female spaces where women could be together and have employment or keep busy or kind of perform the kind of results. And that's not necessarily a bad thing. And maybe for Eliza, that's exactly what she needs, just to get through the days, that kind of that ritual. And you do have in this period a kind of resurgence of kind of Anglo-Catholicism, where in Anglican spaces and within the Anglican Church, some drifts back towards Catholicism or back towards the rites and the rituals of Catholicism. And then obviously, as it always happens, you get the pushback, and kind of more drawing of the kind of contrast between at the Anglican Church and the Roman Catholic Church. I mean, even now, I think last year there was a Church of England changed and is now part of the Roman Catholic Church. So you still get the kind of tension between these two bodies. And I think it's just for Eliza, she's being selfish and she's thinking, what do I want for me? What will be best for me? She doesn't have a connection with people like her sister does. So for her, it's the kind of the repetition and the knowingness of religious rituals and
her final word on it, after my mother's death, I wash my hands of you. I would leave you in the old world and betake myself to the new, as if like I'm doing something better, but you're not. You're just being mean. And that's the way I read her. That her approach to life is still, anti-humane, that she doesn't believe in love or being with other people. So it doesn't matter that she's, praying all the time or performing these rituals. And
it goes back to what Lauren said earlier about nature versus nurture, and how all of these children essentially are broken by their upbringing, and the only one who has survived really in that way is Jane. Lauren, I don't know if you had anything you want to add to that.
They're kind of presented intentionally as two extremes. They're kind of like the Black Mirror version of Austen's Eleanor and Marianne, because they can find no common ground. Eliza has learned to survive by being so detached from people, whereas Georgiana has learned to fill her life with people, and they are so far removed from one another that they can't possibly understand each other. And what Eliza says to her, like, you had no right to be born, for you make no use of your life, like such a horrendously harsh thing to say to another person. And it's interesting that this happens with Jane there, because Jane is the middle ground between them. Jane, they've all had to make a life for themselves because their mother was so terrible. John's killed himself after running himself into ruin. Georgiana is so much a socialite that she can't be alone. She doesn't know how to be alone. And Eliza has gotten so used to being alone that she now cannot abide people. Jane is very much in the center. She has made her independence. She likes people's company, but she also likes her own company. She's kind of created this ideal. And I think this is such a impactful scene because Eliza doesn't need to say this to her sister. Like, she doesn't need to say this. And Jane has learned, what's appropriate to say to someone and what's not appropriate to say to someone. And where do you draw the line between honesty and, the truth, and things like that. It's not, honesty is not always the best policy, and like care and compassion. And you almost get the sense that maybe Georgiana is the most redeemable because she is impacted by others, and you start to see her maybe improving a little bit in Jane's company because she's taking interest in Jane. She at least knows how to be polite to an extent. It's for her own selfish purposes, but she can do it. And I think they're kind of presented as being a doubling down on the argument for moderation. It goes back to the famous line from Udolpho of all excess, all excess is violent, all excess is evil. It doesn't matter if it's an excess of piety or an excess of sociability. Excess is bad. You must always have moderation. You must always find a middle ground. And both of them live in excess. So even though she's pious and she thinks that she's superior because she lives an independent life, she's still excessive and therefore cannot be fully redeemable. But I think you are supposed to feel sorry for both of them, and that in this moment recognize they're victims. Not as much as Jane is, but they are victims. They're victims of the society and victims of the mother that's raised them, and they've done the best with what they have, but they don't really have a chance. Jane is the victor because Jane is the one that got to experience a broader society, and Jane is the one that was less influenced by being the Reeds of Gateshead.
And Eliza is also just not forgiving in that sense. And Karen put the question here: couldn't it be that Jane's relationship with God has grown, and that is why she is able to forgive? And it is not just based on the strength of her personality. The whole chapter is very Christ-like in forgiving those that have hurt you. And she's also being very Helen Burns like, who she will mention, just now as she goes in to see Mrs. Reed for the last time. I thought of Helen Burns, recalled her dying words, her faith, her doctrine of the equality of disembodied souls. It's almost as if Helen is like the saint that Jane prays to and finds her inspiration in. Even more, like, she doesn't say, and I think of Jesus forgiving, people. She thinks of Helen Burns. And I find that very interesting, and especially the doctrine of the equality of disembodied souls, as we talked about long ago in that Helen Burns chapter, where this idea that everybody, that even the kind of, isn't it's this kind of heretical doctrine that even condemned souls have this chance at being redeemed after they are condemned or something, isn't it? That Helen Burns talks about, and that Charlotte Bronte certainly believed in. So let's get to this so we can finish up, because she goes in to see Mrs. Reed here. Nobody's taking care of her. The nurse isn't even there, and she goes in to take care of this poor dying woman. And Mrs. Reed says, well, I must get it over. Eternity's before me. I better tell her. Go to my dressing case, open it, and take out a letter you will see there. And this is the letter from John Eyre, from Jane's uncle, asking for Jane's address, and that Providence has blessed my endeavors to secure a competency. I'm unmarried and childish. I want to adopt her, and childless, not childish. And I want to adopt her. And bequeath at my death whatever I may have to leave. And it was dated 3 years ago. And when Jane asked her, why didn't she tell her? Because just this, again, like, man, like to end your life with just a stream of hate coming out of your mouth is, not the way you want to go. I disliked you too fixedly and thoroughly ever to lend a hand in lifting you to prosperity. I could not forget your conduct to me, Jane. The fury with which you once turned on me, the tone in which you declared you abhorred me the worst of anybody in the world, the unchildlike look and voice with which you affirmed that the very thought of me made you sick, and asserted that I had treated you with miserable cruelty. And then she winds up telling her that, I told him you were dead, that you had died of typhus fever at Lowood. Mrs. Reed isn't making this deathbed confession for her own forgiveness, right? She's just, because it's all still there. That I don't know. Why is she? She starts off with, eternity is before me. So it seems like, okay, you want to make your deathbed confession, but your deathbed confession is, this is how much I hated you, Jane, which isn't much of a confession.
It's almost like she doesn't want to have any unfinished business, which obviously is an idea that comes along later in the 19th century, with some hauntings. But it is that, you know, this isn't a deathbed confession for forgiveness from the person she's wronged. It's also not a deathbed confession to a priest or a religious person for that kind of religious atonement. It's more just kind of like, this is my unfinished business, and I just want it done with. So it's not weighing on. I do think it's interesting though that you do have a parallel with this chapter and the previous chapter in terms of pretending that someone is dead. Obviously, that's what Rochester says to Mr. Mason about Bertha. You may think of her as dead and buried, or rather, you need not think of her at all. And this idea that Jane and Bertha are in some way paralleled, kind of, in, you know, they kind of, in that idea of polluting their families, and they're awkward, and they're these things that no one knows what to do with. So why not just pretend that they're dead? But they're not, obviously, because Jane is still alive. But yeah,
and it does align their situation and how precarious they both are. That they're both women either without family or without place. You know, because we know that Bertha is Creole, or at least, you know, seems to be, and that, yes, seems to have this brother, but that someone else is able to take power over them and say, no, they're dead. You know, because what connections does Jane have otherwise? That they are, you know, they almost don't exist as outside of their own will to define themselves and to exist, which it says a lot about Jane's story, but also about, you know, their situation. And yeah, I don't think that Mrs. Reed, I think it's more about going with no regrets. I think it's more about owning up. Like, I did this thing. I don't care if you know.
Yeah.
Like, I don't regret doing it necessarily, but no one knows I did it. And I'm telling you that I did it.
I want to tell you how, like, the bad thing that I did to you, like a one last act of being mean to you.
Yeah.
I want to make sure.
Yeah, it makes me think of, you know, when people confess to murders on their deathbed. They're often when people make confessions to crimes on their deathbeds, they actually, it's not about forgiveness. There's not a priest, they're not asking for blessing. They're just like, I need someone to know that I did this thing and that you didn't catch me. You can't punish me for it because I'm going to die. And there is beginning at this point in time, this idea that's starting to form of people who are cruel for the sake of cruelty, and people that, you know, why do people commit criminal acts? You know, why do people do these things? And we're getting to the beginnings of, you know, this is why things like detective fiction get born. You know, why do criminals do the things they do? And I think the scene is kind of like that. It's, well, I have to tell someone I did it because you wrong. She's so sure that Jane Eyre wronged her that she was justified. She doesn't feel guilty because she thinks she's justified. She's justified in her actions. So she's not asking for forgiveness. She's fessing up to her attempt to maintain the social order. Like, I denied you a family. I denied you a position. I denied you an identity because I believe that you don't deserve one. And now I'm going to die.
And we get to see the irony of it all in her own daughters, you know, or Georgiana cries, but from what we know of her, that's just, you know, she's crying for herself. And Eliza, neither her nor, the chapter ends with neither of us had dropped a tear. That this is a woman who, you know, who gets what she has, you know, deserved, or, you know, what she has set in motion here. That what she has tried to deny Jane, in a sense, she winds up denied herself as well. She has denied, you know, family and love.
Yeah. And ironically, because John's dead, all three of the girls will live their own lives the way that they choose. And I don't think that we're necessary, you know, I think someone said earlier that the two girls are villains. I don't I think we're supposed to see John as a villain, but the girls are just kind of guilty by association. And I think what we're supposed to see is that actually these three women who are victims of this class-based patriarchal society, because their mother is dead and their brother is dead, no one has power over them. So they will all go and live their lives the way that they choose to live them. Someone just mentioned that there's the uncle, and Georgiana talks about her aunt, wanting to go to her Aunt Gibson, but we get the impression that's something that she wants. Like, she wants to be in her aunt's care, not her mother's care.
Yeah, she doesn't want to be in the house of somebody dying. I want to go where it has fun.
Like, she wants to be with them. So they're all going to go off and live their lives the way that they choose to be, because they're going to get their dowry. The two girls are going to get their dowries, or at least what's left of them.
Yeah, we don't know. Maybe they'll get nothing. Well, Eliza's getting something because she has made sure.
She's like, I've figured mine out.
Perhaps all the money that John got was Georgiana's. So
but it's interesting that you have this kind of like this deathbed kind of ranting of I did my best to protect what I think is right, and that's the social order. And then these three girls who go, well, actually, just gonna get, the two sisters aren't gonna keep in touch with each other. No one's gonna keep the name. Off they go.
No one cries for Mrs. Reed. That's going to be the country song I'm going to write for this. All right. Well, we've gone over today a good bit. So let's end it there, and we will, get to more next week. Bronte Soars and Airheads, thank you all for tuning in today. We'll post this recording on our website if that's how you're watching. Thank you. We have a Sundays with Jane Facebook group. You can continue the conversation. Look us up on Facebook and join in that conversation. But you can also go to the Rosenbach's YouTube account, like the Jane Eyre video, subscribe to the channel, leave comments there as well. If you leave comments there, I can get back to you after the show. Thanks to our chat, Mrs. Fairfax, Brianna, today for managing the links. And next week, we'll have the return of Dr. Kathleen Hudson for Volume 2, Chapters 7 and 8, or Chapters 22 and 23. In which Jane returns to Thornfield, and there is kissing. We finally get to something going on. Kissing. Is this a kissing book? It better be, is my response usually. If you are looking for more virtual engagement, head on over to the Rosenbach website. Check out the other virtual offerings we have, especially the new courses we have up there that you can register for now. The Rosenbach is also open to visit. Even with the COVID surge right now, we're still open to visit. We're making things, go to our website and see how we're making it safe for you to come see our exhibitions and historic house in person. And please support the Rosenbach. You can do by donation. We're asking for donations of $18.47 to support the show, but any donation is welcome. And if you're not already a member, I invite you to join. Mary and Lauren, thank you for your time today in this new year.
Thanks for having us.
Lauren, I wish you well. I hope everything's going to be smooth sailing from here on out. That's what it's going to be.
Thank you.
So, good.
Sure it will be. Keep my blood where it should be, in my body.
Yes. So, no vampires. Well, maybe you could be a vampire, and then because then you could get other people's blood, so that you need.
Yeah, they didn't. The hospital didn't like it very much when that was my suggestion. When they were like, "Where's all your blood gone? You've not been bleeding."
And of course, you said that. Yeah, of course you.
Vampires?
Like...
They were like, "No."
All righty. Playing us out over the credits, everyone, will be Pleated Gazelle's song "Secrets," written especially for the show. Farewell, readers. May you live entirely for and with what you love best on earth, unlike Mrs. Reed. Bye-bye, everyone.
Bye, everyone.